Today, we're diving into a conflict that feels like it's all over our headlines, but its roots, well, they go back over 1,000 years. And this is so much more than a fight over a map. It's a battle over history, identity, and what it even means to be a nation. And that's the big question, isn't it? How did we get here? To really understand today's news, the fighting, and the global shockwaves, we have to go back. I mean, way back. We're going to connect the dots from a shared medieval kingdom all the way to the front lines of the 21st century. So, we've broken this huge story down into 6 key parts. We'll start at the very beginning with their shared origins, then move through the dark days of the Soviet shadow. We'll watch as a nation tries to choose its own path, and then get into the 2014 rupture that really kicked off the modern war. From there, the full-scale invasion, and finally, we'll look at how this whole thing is redefining our world. All right, let's jump in. Okay, part 1, 1,000-year story. You see, to get the narratives that are driving this war, especially the justifications coming out of Russia, you have to start where it all began, in a medieval state that both nations claim as their ancestor. This right here is Kievan Rus. For hundreds of years, this was a powerful, flourishing state with its capital in, you guessed it, modern-day Kiev. It's basically the cultural cradle for 3 nations, Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. And this shared history is a foundation for Vladimir Putin's argument that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, a claim that's going to be put to the test over the next 1,000 years of history. So after the Mongol invasion came and just shattered Kievan Rus, the paths of these two cultures really split. Moscow started to rise as the center of a powerful new Russian state. But Ukrainian lands? They were pulled into the orbit of other powers, like the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And this long separation forged a really distinct Ukrainian culture and identity, one that the growing Russian Empire saw as a threat, so much so that they actually banned the Ukrainian language to try and stamp it out. And this split wasn't just cultural, it was often violent. The war we see today isn't some brand new thing. It is just the latest chapter in a centuries-long fight over Ukrainian independence. As you can see from this timeline of wars, from Cossack rebellions to bids for freedom, this has been a long, long struggle for sovereignty. And that brings us to the 20th century, part 2, the Soviet shadow. Now, this period is absolutely critical. The traumas from this era would forge a modern Ukrainian identity in a crucible of suffering, and it would define the country's relationship with Moscow for generations to come. After the Russian Revolution, Ukraine actually declared independence, but it didn't last long. By 1922, it was pulled into the brand new Soviet Union. And with its incredibly rich farmland, Ukraine became the breadbasket of the USSR, supplying a huge amount of its food. But that importance came at an absolutely horrifying price. 4 million. That's the estimated number of people who died in the Holodomor, which literally means death by hunger. In the 1930s, Stalin's government created a man-made famine right here. They seized crops, sealed the border so people couldn't escape. It's a profound national trauma that Ukraine and many other countries now recognize as an act of genocide. In just a decade later, another disaster. Ukraine became one of the main battlegrounds of World War II, a bloodland trapped between Hitler and Stalin. The human cost was it's almost impossible to imagine. Between the Nazi invasion, the Holocaust, which murdered 1.5 million Ukrainian Jews, and another famine after the war, the country lost a massive part of its population. That kind of suffering gets seared into a nation's memory. And then came what you might call the beginning of the end. In 1986, the Chernobyl nuclear plant disaster happened on Ukrainian soil. The way the Soviet government lied and tried to cover it up just completely shattered public trust. Even the last Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, said it himself. Chernobyl was a turning point. It was the moment the system's lies became too big, too catastrophic to hide anymore. Okay, part 3, a nation chooses its path. So, the Soviet Union collapses and Ukraine is finally independent. But this new freedom, it's defined by this constant, difficult pull between a resentful Russia on one side and the democratic West on the other. In December 1991, the Ukrainian people made their choice crystal clear. In a referendum with a huge voter turnout, over 92% voted for independence. And this wasn't some backroom deal by politicians. This was an overwhelming mandate from the people in every single region of the country. Now here's a crucial moment. The new Ukraine had inherited the world's 3rd largest nuclear arsenal from the USSR, and they agreed to give it all up. In return, with the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, Russia,
the US, and the UK all promised to respect Ukraine's sovereignty and its borders. This was a promise that, as we now know, would be completely broken.
And right at the center of the tension was NATO. So from the Western point of view, it's a defensive club that any sovereign nation is free to join to protect itself. But from Moscow's point of view, every time NATO expanded eastward, it looked like a military threat creeping closer and closer, a broken promise from the end of the Cold War that was encircling Russia. In 2004, all this tension just boiled over. A presidential election was shamelessly rigged for the pro-Russian candidate. But the Ukrainian people responded. Millions poured into the streets in what we now call the Orange Revolution. It was this massive, peaceful protest that forced the Supreme Court to cancel the results and hold a new election, which the pro-Western candidate then won. It was just a stunning display of people power and a clear signal that they wanted a future with Europe. Part 4. The 2014 rupture. This is the year it all came apart. What started as more protests for a European future spiraled into a revolution, a foreign invasion, annexation, and the beginning of a war that would just simmer and burn for 8 long years. So what was the trigger this time? Well, it was a very clear choice. The pro-Russian president Yanukovych, the same guy from the 2004 election, was about to sign a huge trade deal with the European Union. But at the very last second, he backed out and took a multi-billion-dollar bailout from Russia instead. For so many Ukrainians, this felt like the ultimate betrayal of their European dream. And after that, things escalated with terrifying speed. The protests got huge. Then security forces opened fire, killing over 100 people. The president fled to Russia. Moscow called it a coup and moved in. Russian soldiers with no insignia, the famous Little Green Men, took over Crimea. After a sham referendum, Russia annexed it. And at the exact same time, Russian-backed fighters started a war in Ukraine's eastern Donbas region. And this number is so important to remember. Before the full-scale invasion of 2022 ever happened, the war in Donbas had already killed over 14,000 people. This was never a frozen conflict. It was a hot, grinding war with people dying every day for years before it became front-page news for the rest of the world. Part 5. The full-scale invasion. So after 8 years of this simmering war and months of an intense military buildup, Russia launched the biggest conventional military attack in Europe since the Second World War. And it changed the course of history, literally overnight. By early 2022, satellite photos were confirming it. Russia had moved over 190,000 troops to Ukraine's borders, in Russia, in Belarus, in occupied Crimea. And even though Western intelligence was sounding the alarm, a lot of people just hoped it was all a bluff. It wasn't. You know, in those first chaotic hours of the invasion, with Russian forces closing in on Kyiv, the US reportedly offered to evacuate President Zelensky. His reply became a rallying cry for the whole world, and it just perfectly captured the incredible spirit of Ukrainian resistance in the face of what looked like impossible odds. The human cost has just been staggering. Exact numbers are hard to get, but military casualties on both sides are estimated in the hundreds of thousands. More than 8 million Ukrainians have had to flee the country entirely, and another 6 million have been forced from their homes but are still inside Ukraine. This is Europe's biggest refugee crisis since World War II, no question. And the economic damage, it spreads far, far beyond the battlefield. The war sent shockwaves through energy markets, food supplies, and global shipping. It's estimated to have caused over $1 trillion in damage to the world economy, hitting people's wallets thousands of miles away. And that brings us to our final section, Part 6, A World Redefined. Because this conflict isn't just happening in Ukraine. It has completely upended international alliances, sparked economic crises, and forced a global conversation about what sovereignty even means in our time. The global response was incredibly fast. The UN voted overwhelmingly to condemn the invasion. Unprecedented sanctions were slapped on Russia, freezing hundreds of billions of its assets. We saw historic policy changes happen overnight, like Germany reversing decades of tradition to send weapons into a war zone. NATO rushed troops to its eastern border, and the US has led a coalition providing massive amounts of aid. The war's impact hit kitchen tables all over the planet. When Russia blockaded Ukraine's ports, the breadbasket of Europe, remember, food prices shot up because together the two countries export nearly a third of the world's wheat. This caused a huge food crisis, especially in Africa and the Middle East. And at the same time, Europe's dependence on Russian gas led to a massive energy crisis and sky-high prices. Which brings us to what might be the biggest irony of this whole conflict. Putin justified the invasion by saying that Ukraine wasn't a real country, that Ukrainians were just Russians who needed to be liberated. But the brutal reality of his war has done the exact opposite. It has forged Ukrainian national identity in fire, uniting the country like never before, and probably destroying any idea of brotherly nations forever. And so that leaves us with this huge final question. This war is about so much more than land. It's a direct challenge to the whole international system that was built after World War II. It asks a very simple question. In the 21st century, can a powerful country still use force to redraw borders and just wipe its neighbor's sovereignty off the map? The answer to that will define not just the future of Ukraine, but the rules that all of us live by for decades to come.